to today's conference on the human rights situation in Iran. This conference is organized by the associations France Liberté Fondation Daniel Mitterrand, Hands of Cain, Justice for the Victims of 1988 Massacre, FIDU, Italian Federation for Human Rights, and Women's Human Rights International Association. We would like to devote a moment to the Ukrainian issue. 77 years after the Second World War, a new era has begun with the invasion of Ukraine, which is occupying all the news. The Ukrainian people in distress, especially the civilians, deserve effective and comprehensive support. We stand in solidarity with them. We would now like to kindly ask all speakers to respect the unfortunately rather tight timetable. For technical reasons, we only have 2 hours available. I would like now to give the floor to our first panelist, Sir Taher Boumedra, former director of the Human Rights Office of the United Nations, United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq, and expert on the death penalty. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. And hello to everybody. First, I would like to say that on the occasion of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council, members and observer states are presented once again with historic opportunity to lead and support meaningful efforts and to address urgent human rights situations, prevent further violations and abuses, and support victims and survivors in their pursuits of justice. One of these urgent existing human rights challenges is the 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran. As you know, in September 2020, 7 of the special rapporteurs on the human rights, including Professor Javaid Rehman, the special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Iran, 7 UN experts wrote a letter to the government of Iran asking about any investigation of this crime, this heinous crime. The 7 special rapporteurs asked the government of Iran to reply within a certain frame time. But as usual, the government of Iran never replied. A missed opportunity for the government itself and missed opportunity for the Human Rights Council to address this situation. There was also a report from the working group on involuntary disappearances, which had put on record that a missed person's file will remain open for as long as the person is missing. Therefore, the time frame that has lapsed 30 years ago, this crime took place, and it remains on record that it has to be investigated and the perpetrators has to be brought to account. In his recent report on the human rights situation in Iran, Javaid Rehman called on the international community for holding the perpetrators to account and thus closing the door to impunity. Despite all these reports and all these calls on the government of Iran to investigate, it has always replied with dead silence. This situation and this persistent impunity has led to another massacre in November 2019. The workers in Iran went out demonstrating, asking for their fundamental rights, asking the government to improve their situations, and they were faced with another attack and killing of a large number of demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators. So the 1988 massacre is a premeditated international crime. Why is it premeditated? In fact, as soon as the late Khomeini took power in 1979 and prepared for his Islamic Republic's constitution, he started preparing the ground to eradicate, to annihilate all the opposition. And it's in this context that in 1988, he issued his infamous fatwa or decree ordering the extermination of all the opposition, and particularly the members of the Mujahideen Organization of Iran, PMI. So that fatwa was actually a death penalty for all the opposition and the Mujahideen. And the order to kill them, to kill the political prisoners in the prison, was to make sure that the theory of the Islamic supreme leader prevails in the country. So no opposition on a religious or political ground is permitted. So following the fatwa, a machinery was set up to implement this fatwa, and the death commissions were created. Those death commissions, the regime calls them amnesty commissions. They had to do the triage, like in the war. They do the triage of who should be executed and who should be saved. So the line between execution and life was just determined in few minutes on the ground to answer a question whether they still support the PMI, whether they still stand for their beliefs or not. Those who stand with their beliefs, they are put aside for execution. And the operation went on while the United Nations was aware of this massacre and monitoring it without taking any action. If we look at the fatwa was intentional. It was an order to intentionally exterminate a group. It was an operation to massively execute and summarily put to death all the political prisoners who refused to give up their beliefs. So it was an extrajudicial execution. It was an extrajudicial execution which traditionally lawyers qualify it as a crime against humanity. However, this crime against humanity was argued to amount to a crime of genocide, particularly the well-known lawyer, Jeffrey Robinson, who argues that Khomeini's fatwa was actually an order to commit genocide. And his argument was based on the fact that this group, the group of the Mujahideen, were a distinct group, religious group, that their Islamic approach was different from that of Wilayat al-Faqih, the theory of the late Islamic Supreme Leader Khomeini. So if you don't believe in Wilayat al-Faqih and the Islamic Republic's values, you are considered to be a muharaba or enemy of God. And as enemy of God, spreading corruption on earth, the rule is to be executed and to be considered an apostate. Apostates in Islam, their punishment is death. So whoever does not follow the theory of Wilayat al-Faqih is an apostate, is an enemy of God, and therefore should be executed. This is the essence, this is the core meaning of Khomeini's fatwa. So Jeffrey Robinson believes that this is all the elements of a crime of genocide are present. But we should ask the question, what is the importance of making a difference between crimes against humanity and crime of genocide? The reality is that crime of genocide and crime against humanity, the difference is theoretical one, because they are both considered the most serious crimes by international law, and they are both on the list of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Therefore, making a distinction between crime against humanity and genocide is simply to emphasize the seriousness of the crime of genocide. So a crime qualified as genocide traditionally is considered most serious than other crimes. However, the jurisdiction of the ICC makes no difference between the four crimes of its jurisdiction, which are crimes against humanity, crime of genocide, crime of torture, and lately, crime of aggression. So these crimes are equally taken seriously by the international community and in international law. In 2005, the International Law Commission, in its report to the Secretary General, said that the situation in Darfur, in Sudan, the case of General al-Bashir, in Darfur, there was no difference of what happened in Darfur, whether it's a crime of genocide or crime against humanity. It's a serious crime that warrants the attention of the international community and should be treated as a serious crime according to international criminal law. So on this ground, I believe that Jeffrey Robinson, who was a judge of the United Nations judge in Sierra Leone, is emphasizing the fact that what happened to the political prisoners in Iran in 1988 was a genocide. He meant by that to underline how serious was that execution of the prisoners for their belief. But practically, if we raise the question, what is the importance of qualifying a crime as crime against humanity or genocide? In my view, they are both subject of jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. They are both subject of the universal jurisdiction. So the case of Raisi and his co-perpetrators, the list is quite long, actually, of those who perpetrated the 1988 massacre. But Raisi, as president of the Islamic Republic today, he is wanted for crimes against humanity as one of the main perpetrators. And he is now wanted by a number of jurisdictions, that implement the universal jurisdiction over serious crimes in international law, whether crimes against humanity or crime of genocide. So with this, I'll say thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your valuable input. We kindly ask all speakers to please respect the limit of 6 minutes per person, since for technical reasons, we only have 2 hours available. Our next speaker is Professor Annalisa Ciampi, ad hoc judge of the European Court of Human Rights and former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. Professoressa Ciampi, a lei la parola.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all. I speak in my personal capacity now, and I also speak as one of the co-signatories of the letter which was addressed in January of this year to the members and observers of the Human Rights Council, calling for an international investigation in the massacre of 1988. The facts have already been recalled by the first speaker. The decree is known. We know some of the names of the victims. We know some of the names of the perpetrators, and whether we want to qualify those facts as crimes against humanity or genocide, I agree they are core crimes, and they call for international criminal responsibility, international individual criminal responsibility, irrespective of official capacity, including, therefore, heads of states, the current head of state, the head of the judiciary, and other prominent officials. This is the principle, but then the reality is difficult. It would indeed be difficult to bring the perpetrators at this moment before the International Criminal Court. It doesn't seem a current prospect to be able to establish an ad hoc tribunals or an hybrid tribunals. It would be useless to call again for accountability before Iranian domestic courts. Yes, there is universal jurisdiction. It is possible to have domestic accountability before other courts and tribunals around the world. To my knowledge, there is one criminal prosecution in Sweden at the current time as we speak, but that's one. So what else? International criminal law doesn't seem to be a viable option nowadays, not as the main exit door at this particular moment. But human rights are an option now. International human rights law is there because these facts are serious international crimes, but they're also serious human rights breaches, violations, abuses, enforced disappearances, summary executions, extrajudicial killings. These are serious violations of human rights, and they are continuous violation because under international human rights law, the doctrine of positive observation, which is not a principle, is a practice, mandates investigations into those crimes. So I come to the call that will be before the Human Rights Council 2 weeks from now. It's in the report already of the current Special Rapporteur on Iran, a call for accountability into the massacres, because these are continuous violations which are still ongoing nowadays. What are the options before the Human Rights Council? How could this call for accountability be operationalized? What should the member states do? What are we calling them to do? Several options are open, and several options have been resorted to in the practice of a Human Rights Council. The strongest response would be to set up a commission of inquiry, as it was set up in Burundi, for example. But other options, if those are politically available and feasible, should be pursued. A fact-finding mission or a group of experts. Recently, the EU member states were actually at the forefront in the Human Rights Council in the setting up of a group of experts in Ethiopia. And so my call and my prayer is to the member states to put that political will behind this call that the Special Rapporteur will put before them in a few weeks' time. Why for, if I haven't given enough reasons, and not enough reasons have been given by the previous speakers either, I want to add more. We want, the call is a call for accountability. But it also, and most importantly, in my view, and that's my strongest belief, for the purpose of prevention of ongoing violations and future violations as well. The previous speaker already recalled the protest of 2019, and again, a repetition by the Iranian authorities of major breaches of international criminal law and human rights law. We saw a crackdown on protest that was as serious as the violations of 1988. So to me, this is the main message we want. We ask for investigation and accountability. We ask the member states to put that political will for what happened in 1988, for what happened again in 2019, for what is still ongoing, because until there will be an investigation and the victims will be given, at the very least, a right to the truth, these violations and core crimes will be still ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie mille, professore Faccian, per il suo sostegno alla causa e per il suo prezioso intervento. We now move to our next speaker. Maintenant, je donne la parole au député français et vice-président de la commission parlementaire pour un Iran démocratique, Monsieur Hervé Solignac. Monsieur Solignac, je vous en prie.
Merci, j'espère que vous m'entendez correctement. Je veux d'abord saluer chacune et chacun d'entre vous, l'ensemble des participants
for giving me the floor for giving the floor to the CPID to take the floor and to convey their message. First and foremost, I would like to remind you that the voice of the different states, sovereign and democratic states, must be heard in the context that has already been described by the previous speakers. And we should hear their voices when it comes to denouncing the human rights situation and violations in Iran. It applies also for the European Parliament, but of course I don't want to talk about the European Parliament right now, and I don't want to talk on its behalf. The CPID is one of these voices, and we fully agree with the open letter that was sent last month to the Council of Human Rights of the UN, calling for an international investigation. We reiterate as CPID that the time of justice and the time of truth will come. And there should be no doubt with this regard in President Raisi's mind, because we know that there's an international community of human rights which believes that this impunity can no longer be. And those who believe that we may end up by forgetting about what happened, they are wrong. The massacres of 1988, but also those of 2019 are crimes without limitation, and no one will prevent history or justice to prevail. For the first massacre, we should find the truth, and for the second events of 2019, we need to understand the facts to judge and to offer reparation, providing that is possible. You will all understand that the words that we have been using, especially through the voice of the UN Special Rapporteurs, these words have a meaning. Earlier, we talked about crime against humanity. We talked about the genocide, the genocide that are characteristic to the different massacres. And these words, genocide, crime against humanity, call for an investigation commission. We believe that it is now urgent to act. And we also know that the Iranian government is trying to hide the evidence of these massacres, of these extrajudicial killings. And we know that the scope, the scale of this massacre is such that it's impossible and vain to hide these evidence and these proofs. It is pointless. And we also know that the international community will never stop and will never slow down in its duty of vigilance, because nothing would be worse than to pretend that we think that the evidence has been erased. The human rights are universal principles. And France, wherever these human rights are violated, our country, France, must show indignation. But above all, our country should call for governments to stop these violations and to reinstall human rights. And as CPID, we believe that France would turn its back on its culture and on its history if it was to consider that these massacres are none of its business. We believe that the Council of Human Rights must say in the most firm and clear way possible that sooner or later the regime will have to be held accountable. The extrajudicial killings, the tortures, the violations of freedom, the forced disappearance are amongst the worst crimes that could be perpetrated according to international law. But beyond these crimes, there's also another reality. Iran is now fostering terrorism politically, financially, and therefore it is also the world's freedom that is at stake. And we must mobilize against it. Therefore, the message that I would like to convey, to conclude, is to say that the voice of parliaments, especially that of the French Parliament, is a free voice. The Parliament represents the national people. The Parliament has its own voice, and it will continue and has continuously for some years now. Regardless of the different governments that had office in France, the CPID has said and has reiterated how important it was for it to support unwaveringly the Iranian people, the Iranian people's freedom. And therefore, we reiterated, and we will reiterate, that we are hearing the calls coming from different sources, different states, for an investigation commission to be launched, because we believe that this commission is the prerequisite for accountability, for justice that still needs to be served, and also very probably the end of a regime that will have one day or another to give way to a democratic regime that will be able to restore the Iranian people's freedom that they all deserve. Thank you. Thank you very much for this precious contribution.
Sir Claude Nicati, Deputy Prosecutor General of Switzerland from 2001 until 2009, and former President of the Government of the State of Neuchâtel. Sir, the floor is yours.
Merci. Est-ce qu'on m'entend, Samira? C'est bon?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Well, great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me the floor for a few minutes. I will be short and brief. And as I said, I will speak in English, even if my native language is French.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was a former prosecutor, exactly. In what we are talking about today, men, women, and children have died or disappeared. They did not die of old age. Excuse me, it's a bad joke, I know. And they died in great numbers. Even today, the truth about this disappearance and death has not been fully or just a little revealed. We don't know why they died, even if you can imagine that it is related to their political opinion, their idea, or their actions. The government has done nothing, I repeat, has done nothing to justify this disappearance, and even today, nothing is done or will be done. It's the law of silence. We call it omerta. The law of silence is so strong that the dead have been placed in secret mass graves where no one knows who has been dumped. That was over 30 years ago, but it feels like yesterday. It is not possible to rebuild life, a nation, when there are still shadows. The dead should not haunt the living, but for this to be possible, justice must be done. Let me give you an example. I was the prosecutor in charge of the first war crime trials in Switzerland following the genocide in Rwanda. At the end of the investigation and trial, which was not a simple matter, the accused person was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. When I left the tribunal, a Rwandan woman I didn't know hugged me and told me that now she finally knew that now she could mourn the child or husband she had lost, and that she could live. And now she could live. The dead were not going to live again, of course, but she was going to be able to. And I'm coming back to the topic of this video conference from today. An investigation must be conducted in a serious and impartial manner. And following justice, justice with a capital G, must be said. Justice may not be possible in Iran, although it is possible elsewhere. I don't know where, but it should be possible. Only then can the reconstruction be done and these dead can sleep in peace. I appeal to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to ensure that what was possible in Rwanda should also be possible for what happened in Iran in 1988. I'm talking from the justice once again with a capital G. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for your words. Merci beaucoup pour votre soutien.
Thank you for your
We
support.
are now going to hear from our next speaker, who is Professor Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, lead prosecutor at the trial of Slobodan Milosevic in The Hague. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Sharing my time with Hamid Sabi and making a simple arithmetic calculation, we have 13 minutes between the two of us. He is far more valuable than I am. I will be extremely brief. There are two certainties about this, and indeed about many similar awful events. so far as this one is concerned, the events themselves are subject to a great deal of certainty amongst those who want to know what crimes were committed when and by whom. In it, there is enough knowledge at the level of certainty to bring due process were due process of any kind available. The second certainty, a certainty with which the citizen of the world is becoming increasingly aware, and of which the citizen is increasingly certain, is that the world mechanisms for delivering justice of any kind are at best limited and for the most part broken or non-existent. And we have to confront that openly and honestly. Nothing could be more apparent about that than consideration of the prospects of bringing Russia to trial at the moment for an offense proved beyond doubt in the minds of everybody with reason of aggression, but they cannot be brought to trial because, to the disappointment of the world's citizens, the structures of the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice are feeble, failing, and do not serve the interests of the citizens. And we need to have those realities in mind, and speaking hopeful thoughts is very good and encouraging, but doesn't actually deliver anything. And I remember going with Hamid Sabi, who will speak almost immediately, to the Human Rights Council a couple of years ago about something else, not concerning Iran, but concerning the People's Republic of China, to realize how the Human Rights Council itself is vulnerable to such international pressure that it can deliver sometimes nothing of value where really serious events are concerned. My involvement in Iran's tragedy of the late 1980s was because I had a small part in a people's tribunal that was indeed run by Hamid Sabi. And I left that with two certainties. The first certainty was that if civil society, forget the international organizations, because by and large they will fail you for the time being, if civil society wants to do anything, it needs to act in accordance with the strictest principles. No goodwill words, no optimism, because there isn't any, justified. It needs to be realistic and operate with the strictest possible tests of evidence and proof. And that's what was delivered by Hamid Sabi and his colleagues in the Iran tribunal. The verdict, as you will know, or judgment of that tribunal was that crimes against humanity had with certainty been committed. I'll come back to that in my closing remarks. The second certainty for me of the civil society process, again, I repeat, don't pin your hopes on international organizations. They don't often deliver very much. The Yugoslav tribunal has not brought peace to the region of the former Yugoslavia. Whether it's brought consolation for some victims, maybe, but maybe not many. However, the People's Tribunal for the Iran tragedy did bring resolution, certain resolution of certainty to many of the victims, and that in itself was a good thing. The third point, and my last arising from that tribunal, is that by having done what it did at the instigation of the diaspora, not of course of the international community, which fails you, having done what it did and left this safe and secure record, proven to the highest possible standard that crimes against humanity were committed, it paved the way for the only reason for optimism that you may have. And the only reason for optimism that you may have is that, to everyone's surprise, leaders of wicked regimes do sometimes fall into the arms or the prisons of the limited international judicial system. For example, Milosevic fell in completely by surprise to be tried, as indeed did people like Mladic and Karadzic. Now, what Hamid Sabiz is going to tell you when he starts is that as a result of civil society work, acting to the highest possible standards, the Iran tribunal has operated so as to bring at least one person to justice. And it's done that by doing that which the diaspora want for their own reason, and that the imperfect legal international system wants for its reasons when it's able to act, namely a strong and a clear record. And I ask Hamid now to speak.
Thank you very much, Professor. We now give the floor to lawyer Hamid Sabi. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. I will be as brief as possible. As Sir Jeffrey mentioned, some 25 years after the massacre of the political prisoners in 1988, we managed to organize Iran tribunal. This was done not by me, but by the political prisoners themselves. They organized themselves and asked us, a group of lawyers, to help them to run the tribunal professionally. We heard something around 100 witnesses, including a few experts, but most of them fact witnesses who had experienced the horrors of the prisons and tortures, and some of them went up to the point of being executed in summer of 1988, but surprisingly managed to get out because they gave what they thought at the time wrong answers, but it proved to be right and saved their lives. And the horrors were reflected in the reports which documented the events. This is the Truth Commission at 2 stages, and then the actual tribunal hearing, and all these are available on record. As Sir Jeffrey mentioned, a list of the perpetrators who had committed these horrific crimes were prepared in the report of the Iran Tribunal, and one of them passed through Stockholm airport some two years ago in November 2019 and was arrested by Swedish authorities for crimes against humanity. His name is Hamid Nouri. He was in charge of one of the prisons as assistant prosecutor, and his activities as crimes against humanity is being tried by Stockholm court, criminal court. Some 70 witnesses had been called by the prosecutor. The trial had continued for 69 days and will continue until April of this year. It's one of the first events that somebody who had committed these crimes had come and been arrested and been tried in a proper court with all his rights protected for crimes against humanity. But it's only one example, and unfortunately has not changed an iota in the regime approach to human rights. The Iranian regime continued to attack its own people, suppress their human rights. In November of 2019, in response to a simple demonstrations against rise in the petrol prices, the Iranian security forces opened fire with shotgun and machine guns, shot down people, which was again the subject of another people's tribunal, which was held in November of last year and part of it in February of this year, and the judgment of that will come out. These had not impacted sufficiently on the Iranian regime, but the cumulative effect of these activities had been an internal investigation as to what are the consequences of the human rights activities and people tribunals. An internal report which was leaked out warning Iranian officials by Ministry of Justice in Iran that these tribunals may be used by the international courts or municipal courts to arrest and condemn Iranian officials. So we hope this message will get somewhere, and the 43 years of the impunity that has lasted in Iran, which has become a permanent culture and fixture of this regime, would change. It is a hope, but only a hope, that this will affect the Iranian regime. But as Sir Jeffrey mentioned, there is very little support that can be gained from international institutions. There have been none from UN. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights had not been able to visit Iran for the last 20 years. So the chances of getting something more than that is very limited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, lawyer, for your intervention. Our next speaker is Professor Stefan Treschel, President of the European Commission of Human Rights from 1995 until 1999, and judge of the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia from 2006 until 2013. Please, you have the floor. Professor, we are not, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but we are not hearing you. I do not know if it is my problem or if it is a common problem. Could you please turn on your microphone, Professor?
I can lift it. Is that better?
Now we can hear you.
Is it okay now?
Yes, now it is okay. We can hear you.
Is there something else I must do technically? Okay. Okay, dear friends, I am raising my voice to join you in your call for justice and to declare my solidarity. Why do I do this? The promotion of justice has been the main topic of my working life. I have acted as a public prosecutor in my own country. I have acted on the European and international level as a member of the European Commission of Human Rights and of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Does this technically work? Okay. Our help was regularly called for by men and women who alleged to have been directly or indirectly, via individuals close to them, victims of grave violations of human rights. In the case of murder, of course, full restoration is not possible. But some degree of justice can be achieved through serious investigation of the fact, identification of the perpetrators, and conviction of the latter, and inflicting proportional sanctions if found guilty. The ICTY was inter alia called into life in order to bring conciliation to the countries in the Balkans. Unfortunately, this has not really worked very well. But the working of the tribunal has brought a great satisfaction to the victims of mass and other serious crimes. I will never forget the tears of men and many women in front of our tribunal when the responsible criminal actors had been convicted and sentenced to long sentences of imprisonment. This has shown that for the victims, international justice and the creation of investigation and of punishment for the guilty has been of a great value and a very important element in bringing a little bit of justice in this unjust world. All the best in your endeavors. Koniec. The end.
Thank you very much for your intervention. We are now going to broadcast a clip on the human rights situation in Iran, showing parts of the latest report by UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, Javaid Rehman.
UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, Javaid Rehman, released his report to the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. The report covers an overview of some of the key areas of concern, such as the death penalty in Iran, arbitrary detentions, restrictions on freedom of expression, the prevention of peaceful assembly, the right to adequate living standards, government inaction to combat coronavirus epidemic, and the status of women and ethnic and religious minorities in Iran. Parts of this report are as follows. Between January 1st and December 1st, 2021, at least 275 people were executed, including at least 2 child offenders and 10 women, for charges involving murder, drug crimes, muharebe, taking up arms to take lives or property or to create fear in the public, ifsad fil arz, spreading corruption on earth, baghi, armed rebellion, and rape. The use of unlawful force by security, law enforcement, and other state agents continued at an alarming scale in the context of peaceful assemblies, against border couriers, and in places of detention without subsequent investigations or accountability. The use of live ammunition against border couriers continued, leading to the killing and injuring of over 200 individuals between 1st of January and 1st of December 2021. The Special Rapporteur regrets the continued ill treatment by prison guards, overcrowding, and hygiene deficiencies in prison, as detailed in previous reports. Leaked videos from closed-circuit television cameras in the public wards of Evin Prison, hacked by the group Edolat Ali, show prison guards beating or otherwise ill-treating prisoners, overcrowded prison cells, and a solitary cell with inhumane conditions. According to testimonies by former prisoners, the revelations are only the tip of the iceberg of the reality of the country's prison conditions. Rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. The Special Rapporteur is concerned at legislative efforts aimed at restricting the digital space. The bill on protecting the rights of users in cyberspace and organizing social media, currently before the Parliament provides for an increasingly isolationist infrastructure that would, in effect, consolidate a digital wall in the country, increase control over information, and deny the right of freedom of expression set out in international law.
It's now time to give the floor to our next speaker, Professor Jeremy Sarkin, former chair rapporteur of the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate. I speak to you this afternoon as a former chair of the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, but also as a person who's been particularly concerned about the issues connected to the issues of the 1988 massacre. And therefore, in 2021, I joined 152 former UN officials and other international human rights and legal experts, calling for some investigation into what happened in 1988, and then joined the same group, which had expanded to 470 in the beginning of this year, to do exactly the same, which was to call for some investigation to examine these particular issues. I join the sentiments of the earlier speakers who call for international criminal law accountability, but I particularly want to focus on the rights of the families, and particularly on the rights to truth and the issues concerning the missing. And certainly I do so because the prospects for justice are quite limited. Certainly we've seen universal jurisdiction pick up over the last few years, particularly because of the developments around Syria. But certainly we've seen that the UN has been slow to set up international criminal law processes, and then many times there have been blockages, particularly at the Security Council, to take up criminal law matters. So we have an opportunity at the 49th session of the Human Rights Council to break the possibilities to deal with these particular questions and to find ways of examining the extrajudicial killings, the summary and arbitrary executions, as well as enforced disappearances that occurred in 1988. When we talk about the families, we need to understand that at least 3,000 families and maybe 30,000 families and maybe even more are affected by what happened in 1988. There were instructions to execute political opposition prisoners, to enforcibly disappear them. And for that reason, for many years, and I just pick up a few examples, in 2007, Human Rights Watch wrote a report that described those executions as deliberate and systematic, as extrajudicial killings, and condemned them as crimes against humanity. In 2020, 7 UN Special Rapporteurs again put out a statement saying that what happened may amount to crimes against humanity. While the families were informed that they could expect the remains of people to be returned to them on condition there were no ceremonies, no photos in their home, no public protest, nothing was given to the families, and they were promised those remains, but nothing was received by them. So in that sense, we need to understand that the right to truth grants the families certain positions. And it's because the right to truth has become widely recognized in the last few decades. It's now found, for example, in the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, adopted in 2006. Unfortunately, only 64 countries have ratified that particular instrument, and even less have provided the families the opportunity to file individual complaints. But certainly the right to truth is enshrined in the preamble to the document, but also in Article 24, which provides that each victim has the right to know the truth regarding the circumstance of the enforced disappearance, the progress and the results of that investigation, and the fate of the disappeared person. The United Nations principles to combat impunity are particularly relevant. There is impunity for this set of events, and therefore something needs to be done to ensure that progress is made to provide the families with information, hopefully where the graves are, and that the families can ensure that those human remains are respected. The missing as a broad conceptualization, which includes enforced disappearance, have again come to the fore over the last few years. We see that the former UN Commission on Human Rights affirmed the family's rights to know the fate of their relatives. The General Assembly adopted resolutions on those particular matters in 2004 and 2006. In recent years, the Advisory Committee of the Human Rights Council has focused specifically on the missing. And most importantly, in 2019, the Security Council adopted for the first time a resolution on the missing. And it builds on the right to truth as a part of international law that's become widely accepted. And that resolution in 2019 by the Security Council says, and I quote, "It is critical for states to address the issue holistically, from prevention to tracing the location, identifying missing persons, and returning human remains to their families." And that needs to happen. The families have a right to a remedy. They have a right to an effective investigation. They have the right to full disclosure, and they have the right to reparations. And in that regard, the Working Group on Enforced Involuntary Disappearances, in their most recent annual report in Articles 84, called on the government of Iran to focus on this particular question. And they noted that an enforced disappearance continues until the fate and whereabouts of the individuals concerned are established. In other words, it's a continuing crime. And the working group noted that they joined the call for an international investigation into the matter. In fact, that report notes that the working group has 548 outstanding cases from Iran in relation to enforced disappearances in general. Only 20 ever have been clarified, and that needs to be enhanced. One further question is that the working group was supposed to visit Iran in 2004. The government asked for that visit to be postponed, and in spite of numerous requests for the government of Iran to once again schedule that visit since 2004, nothing has happened. So much needs to be done, and there are various possibilities for that. Certainly at the 49th session of the Human Rights Council, which is coming up shortly, some investigation could be set up, similar to the IIIM, which has been established to focus on Syria, or the IIM, which focuses on Myanmar. But there's a possibility for the Security Council to do something, or the General Assembly. So could the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even the Secretary General. So much can be done to deal with those particular questions. But this is a matter that's been going on now for more than 30 years. There's an opportunity and a time to focus on establishing an investigation. The 49th session of the Human Rights Council will set up and dialogue the Special Rapporteur on Iran's report. And these particular issues should be on the table. So it's important, I would suggest, that the Human Rights Council has an opportunity at this particular session to focus on these particular matters and to establish some particular process to take the matter forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Before moving to our next panelist, I would like to remember and kindly ask all speakers to please respect the time limit of 6 minutes, since we have an unfortunate, rather tight timetable. We now move to our next panelist, who is Professor Valerius Ciuca, Judge of the General Court of the EU from 2007 until 2010. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This time I will prefer to speak in French, despite my last conference was in English few months ago. Chers confrères, ma mission est très simple. C'est une mission des juges universels, parce que tout juge doit être universel. C'est pour cela
all judges must
j'apporte des
have a
vifs hommages
universal mission. And this is why I would like to pay tribute to these incredible systems, including the Swedish legal system. They have made their justice system universal, and it's an incredible exception. For different reasons, not only the fact that any legal proceeding and that there should be reparation given to victims and victims' families, but mainly we are now seeing a lapse of moral principles at international level. There are some governments that used to be reasonable, but that seem to have lost their compass. I have always supported the idea that international legal proceedings must be made universal, not only spontaneously as the ex-Yugoslavia trial or the Nuremberg trial. And these international proceedings must be made universal and must work outside of any political interest. I would like now to express my empathy for the families of the victims of the massacres of 1988. I have compassion. Also, I would like to warn people for what is to come, because justice must prevail in the name of universal morality. And not only genocides, tortures, severe crimes, and crimes against humanity, and all crimes in general, because there are crimes that are not necessarily well known, and some don't have the same attention. But what matters are the values of the victims, the values, the universal values of human rights that are embodied by each and every victim, no matter how numerous they are. Also, I would like to publicly congratulate strongly two legal experts who are colleagues of mine within the EU. Christina Lindia Scarzo, General Prosecutor, main prosecutor, who supervised the investigation in Sweden, and Mr. Amir Nouri, who has worked tirelessly on the 1988 massacre, and Judge Juan Alexander, who presided the hearing during the Swedish trial. And I believed that the way that they served justice was exemplary. They acted as knights of justice. He therefore took the decision to move his chamber with 6 lawyers, legal experts, judges, prosecutors, and to move everything to Albany. Why? In order to hear 7 witnesses of this horrendous massacre of 1988. This was incredible. And this actually reminds me of the extraordinary message of a former diplomat and legal expert who was also a professor in my university, the creator of and the founder of Universal Justice, Vespasian Pella. Vespasian Pella has written a century ago. He wrote a book, an extraordinary book, and in which he was considering the potential of an international court for this type of crimes. Mr. Bent, an American prosecutor who is now a little over 100 years old, who was inspired by this German legal expert who organized the Nuremberg trial. There was no foundation for positive law. He based himself off natural law. And I believe that our mission is exactly that. It is to restore the ideology of natural law, because natural law covers everything that is simply unacceptable in someone's behavior, or a government's behavior, or a political group's behavior, or a military group's behavior on our planet. So this is the message I wanted to share with you. Thank you. And I wish you success in your endeavors. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for your contribution.
Opportunity to talk about these very important issues. I propose, because my English is not so fluently, and for my speech, I wrote, and I will use Rabat, if it is not trouble, to read my...
Accountability through a UN inquiry into the 1988 massacre in Iran on basis of the facts. In 1988, the government of Iran massacred 30,000 political prisoners. The executions took place based on a fatwa by Supreme Leader Khomeini. 3-member death commissions were formed across Iran, sending political prisoners who refused to abandon their beliefs to execution. The victims were buried in secret mass graves. The perpetrators continue to enjoy impunity. They include Iran's current president Ebrahim Raisi and Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Mohseni-Ejei. I am among the 470 distinguished experts who signed the open letter to the member states and observers of the UN Human Rights Council. I appeal to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet to urgently establish an inquiry into the 1988 mass executions and enforced disappearances. I appeal to the UN member states to support the Special Rapporteur's call for accountability over the 1988 massacre during the upcoming interactive dialogue on Iran that will take place at the Human Rights Council on the 17th of March 2022. Thank you.
I think Robert read it very good, very well, and understandable. And I do like your best wishes and more greetings from our little people of Kosovo and from my country, Republic of Kosovo. Have my best wishes for your work and your efforts to be everything on the right.
Thank you very much, Ms. Apok, for your support and your words. Nous allons maintenant entendre Monsieur Gilbert Mitterrand, président de la Fondation Daniel Mitterrand, France Liberté.
President of the
Monsieur Mitterrand, vous avez la parole.
Daniel Mitterrand France Liberté organization. You have the floor.
Oui. Vous m'entendez? Merci.
Can you hear me?
Nous vous entendons.
Bien.
Thank you.
Merci. La situation des droits de l'homme en Iran s'invite une fois de plus.
Human rights in Iran are again going to be debated during a session at the Human Rights Council. One more time. And this is one time too many because the Human Rights Council has countless testimonials, countless reports on the situation. But we can see that the current situation, the facts, the evidence that continue to worsen is something that takes too long, way too long to be solved. The feeling that we have is that the regime is able to act with impunity, even within these Iranian institutions and authorities. But we have this aftertaste because we can see that these international institutions are not doing much against this impunity. Therefore, making real these proceedings within the UN agencies on the massacres of 1988, amongst others, because there were other massacres, including in 2019, 2017. So making these proceedings and procedures real would be giving and serving justice, yes, but it would also show that we are firm. And it would be really relevant from democracies, from the UN, and even more so, even more relevant currently in the current period, because it goes beyond what's going on in Iran. The voice of democracies is a weapon, and democracies should use this weapon. And the report, Javaid Rehman's report, is a very important one because it confirms all the previous reports, but above all, it gives arguments on the obvious violation of human rights that are happening and that have happened in Iran, and the way that mechanisms of human rights are disregarded by the Iranian regime. Torture acts have not been investigated. In 2021, last year, at least 275 people have been executed in Iran, at least. And this report shows the legal failings of Iran, and it shows that there's systematic violation to the right of a fair trial. And it also talks about the use of violence in detention centers and during peaceful protests. And the local authorities in Iran are not investigating on this, and they are not suing these people and the perpetrators. So there's no internal investigation. So I feel like we don't have this momentum yet in order to finally have this international investigation. According to this report, the conditions of detention with packed prisons makes it impossible for human dignity to be respected. The condition of foreigners who have two citizenships are used as pressure against foreign governments. The violations against different types of freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of gathering. And this report even gives arguments to the UN. The UN has already made clear declarations. The UN has talked about the poorest of people in Iran, people who don't have access to food, who don't have access to education, to housing. This report tells us that 28 million Iranian people live in areas where there is water shortage, especially in the center or the south of the country. Access to drinking water is inseparable from human rights and is therefore part of the Article 11 and 12 on socio-economic and cultural rights declaration. And I was quoting the report here. This report talks also about the situation of women and girls since the fact that in November 2021 there was a law that was passed against them. What else do they need? What else is necessary for states to hear, to listen, to denounce, to act? The geopolitical principles are probably putting obstacles for the truth to emerge. But this report is a fundamental element for all the people who have been fighting since 1988 for the recognition of the massacre. Because in this report, they talk about this very massacre and they talk about what happened and about the impunity. Therefore, it is about denouncing this institutional impunity in Iran, and I would go as far as saying that it is about denouncing Iran's impunity as a whole, but it's also about understanding what are the obstacles to the accountability that is necessary, and the international community should ask to bring the perpetrators to court. And the main perpetrator is the leader of the country. So we have to repeat it, reiterate it. There will be no limitation. This fight in order to sentence these perpetrators need to be successful. But we need to act now because time is of the essence and the number of victims is only growing. The civil society, alongside the Human Rights Council, is asking different governments to take responsibility now that they have this report available, and governments need to make decisions to act and to not hesitate when fighting these dictatorships. And the dictatorship of Iran has been clearly identified, and we know that the voices of democracies should be heard and they should be used as a weapon. Thank you. Thank you very much for your tireless support to this cause. I would like to give the floor to Sarah Nouri of the Paris Bar. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to draw your attention on the situation of girls and women in Iran, because the European Parliament has adopted on February 17th a resolution against the death penalty in Iran. and has also alerted on the honor crime. And the girls and women have been victims, including Romina Ashrafi, who was decapitated during her sleep by her father while she was sleeping. We also have Mona Haidoni, a 17-year-old who was a mother. She has been decapitated by her husband in February, and we have a video of her husband and cousin smiling in the streets with the head cut off of this woman in their hand. The husband was arrested, but there is no charges against him because according to the Islamic Republic's law allows him to have impunity or at worst to go to prison for 10 years. And instead of drawing lessons from this loophole, some leaders believe that Instagram and the cyberspace is probably what led to the murder of this woman and of the collapse of families, I quote. According to the different reports that were talked about today, every year 400 to 500 women are killed in crimes related to honor. The social networks talk about these crimes that are not subject to sanctions, and of course there are a lot of them that are unreported. You need to understand that these tragedies are actually related to misogyny that has been almost institutionalized. And according to the misogynist legal framework, women are not considered as human beings, but women are men's objects. These honor killings are used a lot, and they talk about honor a lot when talking about women and women's behaviors. You have a lot of posters in Iranian cities signed by the guardians of the revolution that qualify men whose wife wears makeup as a man whose honor has been damaged. And this big word is in red, and it's written on these posters. So we can see that also forced child marriage lead to the killings of a lot of women, a lot of teenagers. Victims of forced marriage are victims of violence and sometimes are killed. In the report of 2022, it is said that it is even more worrisome, especially that in isolated areas, the fact that people are more and more poor and families are looking for a revenue. 31,000 girls between 10 and 14 have been forced to be married in 2021. It is an increase compared to 2020, and over 6,000 newborns came from these marriages in 2021. And in order to cheat public opinions, especially women's activists, the regime of the mullahs is sometimes talking in the media, pretending that it cares for women. There's a bill on the so-called protection, dignity, and security of women that is constantly being debated, but it has never been ratified or implemented. So the reality of the political system is that it's very misogynist. These women, the government is hostile to the women of Iran. The Council of the Guardian of the Constitution has ratified in November 2021 a law that has been ordered by Ali Khamenei in order to increase the demographic growth. As a consequence, there is a strict ban on sterilization and of abortion, and makes it really difficult to have access to contraception. You also have direct and indirect incentives that are proposed on the side that also foster even more child marriage. So in Iran, where people are very poor, where prostitution is widespread, the legal age for marriage is still 13 for women, but younger women can also be married as long as their father agrees. And this is a violation of international law. As said before, we should expect in the future that there will be even more child marriage, teen pregnancies, and divorced children. Therefore, as a conclusion, as long as this anti-feminist and theocracy of the mullahs remains, the freedom, social justice, the security of women will not be guaranteed. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I will now leave you with the second part of the clip that we have previously started watching on the human rights situation in Iran.
Principles of rule of law and separation of powers. Accountability for serious human rights violations represents a core obligation of states under international law. Emblematic examples of failure to ensure accountability. The Special Rapporteur, other human rights mechanisms, and civil society have, over the years, documented examples of grave violations of human rights. These include the large-scale use of lethal force by security, law enforcement, and other state agents against peaceful protesters in nationwide protests in 2009, 2019, 2020, and 2021, leading to alarmingly high numbers of injuries and deaths, together with arrests, enforced disappearances, detentions, prosecutions, and executions. Other examples include large-scale enforced disappearances and summary executions of real or perceived political dissidents, including children in 1982 and 1988, which to date have not been the subject of any investigation or accountability, but where destruction of evidence for those crimes is ongoing in what appears to be an official state policy of wiping these events from memory. The assassinations in the period of 1988 to 1998 of dissidents, intellectuals, and artists known as the chain murders remain without accountability, as do killings of activists outside of the country's borders. More examples include the downing of Ukraine Airlines flight PS752 and the systematic use of lethal force against border couriers. November 2019 protests. Over 2 years have passed since the brutally repressed nationwide protests of November 2019 without any concrete measures taken to ensure accountability for the use of force against protesters and for subsequent actions against them and family members who seek justice. The Special Rapporteur had previously reported on the unprecedented use of excessive and lethal force by state security forces during those protests, including by the police and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including its Basij militia. Culture of impunity and reprisals. The system of governance and the corresponding absence of a system of accountability has created a culture of impunity that perpetuates the cycles of violence, since violations of human rights have no consequences for the state or for individual perpetrators. There appears to be a state policy of intimidating, prosecuting or silencing those who call for accountability, justice, and truth, whether they are victims themselves, relatives, human rights defenders, lawyers, or organizations. Emblematic examples are the imprisonment of Mariam Montferret for seeking truth and justice for her relatives who were forcibly disappeared and executed in 1988. Threats and harassment against individuals seeking accountability for the loss of their family members following the downing of Ukraine Airlines flight PS752, and attacks against and arrests of family members seeking accountability for their children killed in protests or in prison, such as the arrest and imprisonment of Massacre, the father of a protester killed in the November 2019 protests. The Special Rapporteur urges the international community to call for accountability with respect to long-standing emblematic events that have been met with persistent impunity, including the enforced disappearances and summary and arbitrary executions of 1988 and the November 2019 protests.
We now hand over to our next speaker, Professor Eric David, professor at the Free University of Brussels and expert in international criminal law. Please, the floor is yours.
Fait par le rapporteur des Nations Unies sur la situation des droits de l'homme en République islamique
The rapporteur of the UN on the situation of the human rights in Iran. This report was made available by the General Assembly of the UN on January 13th of 2022. The report is, without any surprise, quite telling for the situation in Iran, because it highlights different facts that are violations against human rights, basic human rights. I quote, arbitrary deprivation of life, especially the people of the Kurdish communities that have been killed in 2021. There were also the killings of people, young people, less than 18 years old, accused of crimes who have been killed without a trial. There were also protests, and these protests were repressed, and they shot the activists. Of course, there were people who were wounded and killed. In Iranian detention centers and in Iranian prisons, there have been deaths, also unexplained, in very obscure circumstances, including Kurdish prisoners in 2021. And beyond that, you also have an explanation of the conditions of detention of these people, where they denounce poor treatment of people, usage of torture, hunger strikes that are initiated by these prisoners in order to denounce these conditions, and that lead to no improvement. There are people who have been imprisoned for years who even had to pay a bail in order to be freed, and who were not freed. So all these facts are what we can call persecutions for mainly political reasons. And these facts, so violation of human rights against civilians who are in detention, is called as such, and it is a crime against humanity as the ICC defined it. And I know that Iran is not in the status of the ICC. We need to wait for it to be part of this status. However, the dispositions of the ICC are dispositions that we can call traditional tribunal. The status is the expression of the resolutions, material resolutions, and this is the expression of customary law. So I think we can say, without fearing of being wrong, that the report that was issued by the the Special Rapporteur of the UN in January on the situation of human rights in Iran, these facts can be characterized as crimes against humanity according to customary law.
Merci,
Thank you.
Professeur, pour votre intervention. We now hand over to our next speaker.
Thank you for your contribution.
Professor Alfred Maurice Desayas, former UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. Please take the floor.
Bonjour, sœurs et frères.
Good afternoon, dear brothers, dear sisters.
Bonjour.
I'm honored to be able to express a few words of solidarity during this sad event on the Human Rights Council. Thank you for inviting me. As you know, I have had the opportunity to visit the Ashraf camp in Albany in 2019. And I would like to say that justice is dear to me. Not theoretical justice, but justice that includes and that highlights truth and facts for victims and their families. There should be an international investigation. I have prepared a text that I would like to read to you. Unfortunately, I just broke my glasses, the ones that I used to read. So very quickly, I will read my text. The Human Rights Council, the UN, and all of humanity have the right to know the truth and to have justice served. The victims of the massacre of 1988 and all of the other massacres and human rights violations have the right to have an international investigation. They must continue the important work of Tar Boumedra, especially following his book of the untold story of Camp Ashraf and inquiry into the 1988 mass executions in Iran. When I was independent expert on international law, I requested an international investigation, and I supported Mrs. Asma Arandia's report, and I also joined the requests expressed by Javaid Rehman, reporter. I also join the letter that was signed by my colleagues, the different rapporteurs who have signed this letter in December 2020. Clement Boul, Javaid Rehman, Touani Anoline, Fabien Fabioli, amongst others. The former judge of the UN in the Sierra Leone court, whom I know very well, Sir Geoffrey Robertson, personally interviewed about 40 survivors of the 1988 massacre, and he has described the massacres as the worst crime against humanity since Second World War. And I myself, when I visited the Camp Ashraf in Tirana, I was able to talk to a lot of victims. And I visited the museum, and it's striking. I was able to see the horror that the victims and the families of the victims have been confronted to. Of course, we could talk about a people's court, but the scale of the 1988 massacre would justify a specific legal status for the court, status from the UN. As we know, in 2012, a citizen tribunal organized by victims and organizations that defend human rights in The Hague have tried to denounce the crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated in 1980s rather, in Iran. But there wasn't a single perpetrator that was sentenced or judged or tried. But we believe that Hamid Noed, this case is really important because all countries in the world should use the possibility to call upon universal jurisdiction, as Sweden did recently. Since August 10th, 2021, the Swedish court has been trying a former Iranian perpetrator involved in the 1988 massacre. It's a historical but also highly politically sensitive trial, knowing that the current president of Iran is suspected to having been involved in the massacres and to having ordered the executions. An Iranian citizen was arrested in the fall of 2019 when he got off the plane on his way to visit his daughter in Sweden. With this universal court, the former civil servant of the legal system in Iran is being tried for crime against humanity, including torture and inhuman treatment and murder. Nouri is suspected to have been highly involved in the arbitrary killings of 1988. And it is the very first time that a stakeholder of this very dark time is being tried. It is also the most important trial for crime against humanity in Sweden, according to a Swedish lawyer who specializes in international crime. 2 years ago, Mr. Nouri, who was in charge of a prison in Iran, was arrested. And he had a lawyer, but during the trial he said, it wasn't me, you had the wrong person, it wasn't me, I was on holiday during that period, etc., etc. But there were witnesses. Most of them were Mujahideen and they gave evidence, they testified in the court. And like most of the victims were members of the Mujahideen. They were defending the point of views and interpretations of Islam that were completely contrary to what Khomeini was promoting. And a lot of legal experts have said that the massacre of 1988 justified, and it was really important actually, to be categorized not only as crime against humanity. It was obvious that it was a crime against humanity, but it could be deemed and involved in Article 2 of the Convention. At the beginning of November 2021, the trial was moved to Albany temporarily in order to hear 7 members who were residing in the Ashraf 3 camp, not far from Tirana, because they could not go to Sweden, because they didn't have a passport, quite simply. They couldn't travel. This is why the tribunal went to Albany, and they were able to hear these 7 people who say that they recognize that man. And there was a media coverage, large media coverage on TV. And it was also broadcasted in Iran. And this is something that is important psychologically. Having this information for people who live in Iran, not only for us, people in the Western world, in Sweden, in Switzerland, in Germany. Of course, it's important to have this information, but it's also important for this information to be available in Iran. In any case, the trial continues. We are waiting for the end and the outcome in 2022. So this is the first step towards justice. But we shall see if the call to the human rights to create an international commission to investigate the massacre of 1988 will be heard. And I do hope that the right to know the truth and the right to have justice will happen. Thank you. Thank you for your support and thank you for your valuable contribution. I would like to ask the different speakers to stick to the 6-minute lapse we gave you. And now I'm going to give the floor to the last speaker, President of the Human Rights International Organization. You have the
Bonjour, je remercie.
Hello, I would like to thank the different speakers. Thank you for partaking in this conference. I am happy to welcome you as organizer of this meeting, which is held on the day of the opening of the Human Rights Council. I believe that a lot of important elements have been mentioned, and this will help us to obtain an investigation on the massacre of 1988 and a commission on for this investigation. In 2007, when this case took a turn, and when we started asking for this investigation and for this commission, a lot of meetings have been held since then. Different organizations Iranian organizations have started to talk and to work on this in different countries. Countless articles have been drafted and published. Hundreds of thousands of letters have been sent from Iran and abroad to the different UN bodies. Very useful reports have been published, such as the 200-page Amnesty International report in 2018, which has helped tremendously. Very interesting information have also been published, including in the book Crime Against Humanity of the Mujahideen of the People in Iran, which includes a lot of details on the massacre of 1988. Where it says that 5,000 members of the Mujahideen have been executed as part of the 1988 massacre. We are happy and honored to have incredible people alongside us today, Mr. Boumedra, Mr. Zayas, Professor Eric David, Mr. Gilbert Mitterrand from the Daniel Mitterrand Foundation, France Liberté, who works tirelessly on this and has been working on this tirelessly for years now. And the fact the world has remained silent for so long. The world has been shutting its eyes and trying to cover its ears. But with everything happening in Iran, there's a continuous campaign abroad, and we have made a lot of progress. Mr. James Ramon's report is a major milestone for our fight. Now, of course, I must highlight that the presence of Ibrahim Raisi, a perpetrator of the 1988 massacre at the head of the government of the mullahs since August 2021, has been a shock for the Iranian people. But this also made the massacre bigger than it was before. It was not only the human rights defenders' business anymore. The young generation in Iran has started to act. There have been a lot of protests. The Iranian people is demanding justice. And now is the right time for the international community to respond to the Iranian people's plea. And this is why I call upon all the participants to this conference, to the different speakers, please support this plea. You can, for instance, post a tweet at the end of this meeting. You can even send a letter to your Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to ask the ministry to support paragraph 71. Mr. Javaid Rehman will be talking on March the 17th at the UN when the report will be presented, and it is essential for Western countries to help this cause move forward. You should be able to make this request on the behalf of the Iranian people. The Iranian people will be following closely this meeting. I am certain of this. The Human Rights Council is an important event, and we cannot wait to see the reaction of countries, especially democratic countries, your countries. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Karimi, for your tireless work for the defense of human rights in Iran.
And as special thank you goes to our distinguished panel, the control room, and each of you in the audience. Thank you for being with us. We wish you all a good day.